Hello, I'm Cesare Figari Barberis, postdoctoral researcher at Leiden University, and together with my colleague and friend Mirkamran Huseynli from Vitatus Magnus University, we wrote together this paper called Obliged to Hate, the Successful Stigmatization of Anti-War Voices in Azerbaijan. This research essentially brings together three concepts: emotions, norms, and norm violation in particular, and stigma, and how these three concepts interplay with each other. In particular, the emotions that are triggered and evoked in the stigmatized, and norms in the sense of emotion norms. So emotions which have to be respected, with which a community needs to comply in certain situations. In terms of the stigma in particular, we analyze what emotions that go beyond shame are triggered in the stigmatized. The IR literature tends to focus and give a lot of attention to the emotion of shame triggered in the stigmatized. So the idea is that for stigmatization to be successful, in the sense that the stigmatized go back to complying with certain norms or self-censor, self-silence, or are marginalized, shame needs to be triggered in the stigmatized. There's also some research which focuses on fear and anxiety triggered in the stigmatized. However, the literature that goes beyond the IR, which is on stigma in general, has a greater array of emotions which can be evoked in the stigmatized. So we look at other emotions, for example, sadness, depression, or helplessness, hopelessness, these feelings of not having any hope, which can also be very important in the long term for the successful stigmatization of stigma. On the other side, we look at emotions and norms, as I said, so emotion norms, and in particular, the emotional obligation of hatred. Why the emotional obligation of hatred? Because in moments of war, in moments of conflict between two societies, there can be an emotional norm of hatred or of anger against the enemy, the ethnic enemy. We analyze this through the case of Azerbaijan and the Karabakh War. Karabakh is ex-contested region between Azerbaijan and Armenia, which is the jure part of Azerbaijan, but was de facto controlled by Armenian forces until 2023. In 2020, Azerbaijan launched a war to retake control of Karabakh, which was held by Armenians. And the Azerbaijani state, having built through time an emotional obligation of hatred against the Armenian enemy, expected people to comply with this emotional obligation of hatred. So society was supposed to show and display hatred against the enemy Armenian while this war was being conducted. However, a small minority of anti-war voices contested this obligation of hatred. So they contested the fact that they should feel and display particular hatred against the Armenians, and they contested the legitimacy of war for solving this conflict. Now, the state did react partially. Secret security services did partially pressure these anti-war voices, but interestingly, it was society as a whole that mostly stigmatized these anti-war voices. They were called Vatan Haini, which means traitors to the homeland. They were called Ermeni Perest, so pro-Armenians, or simply Ermeni, so they were called Armenians. The idea is that since they do not respect this emotional obligation of hatred against the enemy, against the national enemy, then they are either traitors to the homeland or they're not part of the nation in the sense that they are Armenians or pro-Armenians. And so we study in this research through interviews with 43 anti-war stigmatized people, the effect of these stigmas, so Vatan Khaini, traitor to the homeland, and many, on these voices. And what we find indeed is, in addition to feeling shame, anxiety, and fear, two emotions which were particularly relevant in bringing them to self-silence and self-censor in the long term were sadness, depression, and hopelessness. So it was in particular the fact that they felt there was no hope for change, in addition to also feeling anxiety and shame, that made them feel that there was no point in continuing to raise their voice. There was no point in continuing contesting this emotional obligation of hatred. So for the future, in the case of Azerbaijan, the situation looks very bleak. But more broadly, we hope with this research to have highlighted a more the great array of emotions that are triggered in the stigmatized, and when the stigmatization is successful, what emotions in particular lead to self-censorship and to self-silence. And on the other hand, also the power of certain emotional, in particular these emotional obligations of hatred, which push society without necessarily the need of the state, but push society to stigmatize non-compliers to this emotion norm. So we discuss how possibly there is a powerful emotional energy in certain emotional obligations and in hatred in particular.